So today I'd like to talk to you about creating a nonprofit budget. If you enjoy this video or the one I recently did on should I create a nonprofit, I hope you will like my channel and maybe even give me some feedback. So if you're watching this video, it's probably because you're working with a startup or a very young nonprofit, because once you apply and receive your IRS status, you will already have formalized those processes. So you may be daunted by creating a budget. You might not really know much about accounting. Neither do I. But a budget is not really accounting. I would like you to think of a budget as a plan. It will help you understand what the numbers are, and it sort of will translate the numbers into a story for your organization for the next year, and then the story back into the numbers. It will show what your priorities are for the coming year, what your goals are, what your expectations are, and creating a budget is really a year-round process for a nonprofit. It takes planning, it takes monitoring, it takes working with your board, so there's governance involved, and then there's the whole, adding to it and building it along the year as you are producing your programs and incurring expenses and hopefully getting some revenue. So like I said, it's a year-long process. So when you need to have that budget in place to be approved by your board, the process should start several months before. And the preparation for actually sitting down and creating that spreadsheet, so to speak, is really just as important as making the document. I use QuickBooks. I use the nonprofit edition. It's really helpful to me because I am not a financial person, and there's lots of cool things that I've learned that make my life easier. And I'm not going to talk about QuickBooks right now. I probably couldn't talk about it very well, but there's probably other good YouTube videos about nonprofit edition of QuickBooks. Anyway, okay, so the steps. The first step in creating a nonprofit budget is to decide who is going to be involved in the process. You probably have a board and at least 3-4 minimum board members. And if it's that small of a group, that might be who creates the budget. You might bring in someone who has some financial background who can really help you structure and give you that professional assistance. But I hope you would have somebody like that on your board to begin with. But if it's a small group, that's who's involved. If it's a larger group, you may already have a treasurer of your organization. You may have a finance committee. Certainly as an organization grows, that's what it will evolve to. And for my organization, we have a finance committee and we have a treasurer. And I ask him lots of questions, and then he helps that committee to understand, and then he also helps the full board to understand when we're sitting at a meeting. But for a small nonprofit, it might just be all hands on deck, like everything else is with a small nonprofit. So create a calendar with the group. You want to know when you're doing the planning for the budget and when you're actually going to sit down and do the creating of the budget. Like I said, one should happen a few months before the actual creation of the budget. So make sure when you plan your calendar out for the next year, say your fiscal year runs January 1st to December 31st, you might want to start planning probably after the summer if you're new, because it might take you a little while longer and it might take you a bit to really gather your data, which I'm going to talk about next, so that you can create the budget. But I would give yourself at least several months before you need to have the budget approved by the board. And certainly you're going to have that budget approved by the board before the beginning of the fiscal year. So you see what I mean about backing things up and giving yourself enough time, because you certainly don't want to be creating a budget under pressure and your board members won't appreciate it. So set the planning time. Sit down with everybody and talk about what your goals are financially for the coming year. Are you planning on raising money to put in reserves? Are you opening, say, a brokerage account or an endowment fund? Or are you really just on a shoestring budget? And if you are, you should run some cash flow reports, but that I'll talk about that later. If you're really on a tight budget, you're going to need to worry more about your cash flow, covering payroll if you have any, paying your bills, that kind of thing, paying for your materials. But let's just assume that you've done okay this first year or so, and you have enough money to cover your expenses. You're going to think about what's next. What programs are we going to create? What's going to cost us money next year? We have capital expenses. You're probably not buying a building right up front. Maybe you are. Are you hiring someone? If you're hiring staff, it's not just a line for salary. It's a line for salary. It's a line for benefits. It's a line for taxes. It's a line for insurance. So there's a lot to consider financially with that. Also, think about what you expect your revenue streams to be in the next year. If you are thinking of creating a membership format where people will pay dues, you can make some good guesses on that. But be cautious and be realistic. And I'm going to talk more about that when we get to talking about revenue. Just suffice to say for now that different revenue streams are going to come into play as you start planning. Now gather your data to answer your questions about what next year is going to look like and how you're going to meet your goals that you were discussing in your planning phase. If you really don't have a lot of time under your belts and you really don't know what to expect, do some research on what I would call peer organizations that are very similar to you in the same area. If you're talking about a arts and entertainment sort of organization, you might look at some similar ones in other cities that are young. This is where you can even call up someone from a nonprofit. A lot of times we're very happy to help somebody else learn what we've learned because we've asked people when we were there. So I would encourage you to do that kind of research. There's probably other stuff on the internet where you can do some research and get some statistics. And so that'll be helpful to answer your questions. I think your board members, hopefully, if you've chosen wisely, will have some insights and some educated opinions. And again, this is why it's helpful to have somebody on your startup board that has a financial background. Okay, so now you've done all of that. Some time has gone by, and you're going to sit down and create the actual budget. If you have any accounting for the previous year, if you were just making an Excel spreadsheet the previous year and putting in your expenses and any revenue, use those numbers because those are your actuals. And that's a great place to start. It's a lot better than starting from absolutely no data at all, even though things are going to change a lot for next year. But use your actuals if you have them. Like I said, you're going to have to use your experience and your predictions in the absence of that data, and you're going to account for that degree of uncertainty. I think you should start on the expense side. Now, you probably know, just from doing even if you don't have a format for your budget in your household, you know that there's money coming in and there's money going out. And so on a budget, it's called revenue and expenses. So I would recommend that you would start with the expenses side. And there's different kinds of expenses. I'm going to talk about a few of them pretty briefly. There are restricted and unrestricted. Nope, sorry, that's revenue. I'm getting ahead of myself. There are program expenses and supporting or operating expenses. Program expenses are things that actually go towards the programs you're providing. So if you are bringing food to elderly people, then your program expenses are going to be the actual food and the the materials that you use to do that, that kind of thing. And then your supporting or operating expenses are going to be your overhead, salaries, telephone, postage, all those kinds of things. It's better to overestimate a little. That's just the way I roll. I overestimate a little bit. I always err on the side of under promise and over deliver, and that helps me ensure that I will do that for the following year. It's better to overestimate than underestimate when it comes to your expenses. Believe me. In addition to not just disappointing and ticking people off, a lot of times in the bylaws of an organization, the executive cannot exceed the budget either at all or by a certain percent or a certain amount with getting approval by the board. And you're not going to want to go to your board in 6 or 9 months into the next fiscal year and have to ask them for money and explain why you really didn't account for it. That would not engender a lot of confidence in your skills. Okay, you get it. Like I said, on a tight budget, I would encourage you to do cash flow projections. I'm not going to talk about cash flow projections. It's probably, again, something you do at home. You kind of look out the next several months and see what's coming down the pike in terms of inflow and outflow. Make sure you feel like you're going to be covered at all points of time. My worst fear in running an organization is that I won't be able to cover payroll. It's not a problem for me at this point, but it still keeps me up at night because I would absolutely be devastated if I messed up people's income. Blah. All right. At the same time, I just want to say really quickly that it's okay to run your organization at a deficit if it's a planned deficit. If you know that the next year you are going to be purchasing computers and the board okays the budget with a deficit because you have that in a plan, then it's okay. But again, like I said, you don't want this to come up unexpectedly. It's not a good surprise. Okay, next I'm just going to talk about the revenue side, the fun side. And I'm going to do another video about revenue streams because I think it's really important for you to really understand those. But in terms of revenue on a budget, be more conservative, but be optimistic. More conservative than maybe you think you want people to be excited and think, oh, we're going to do great next year, but be conservative, but optimistic. There's more uncertainty on a revenue side because you might get a grant. You might get an estate gift, which is lovely. And then on the other hand, there might be problems in the economy, and you might have a dip in revenue. And so you want to sort of plan to budget for those kinds of eventualities. Again, using your background, your group's background, your experience, their experience, and account for that uncertainty. Test out a couple scenarios. I used to work for an organization and they would say, create your budget. And you create your budget, you submit it, and you're all excited. And then they come back, okay, now do it with minus 5%, and do it minus 7.5%, and do it minus 10%. And that was nerve-wracking, but it was a really good exercise because it really helped to focus again, what are my priorities, my plans, my expectations for the next year? And if I don't hit those revenue targets, where am I going to be? And so I would encourage you to do that. And then that'll help you decide ultimately what your numbers are going to be. Once you have your budget, then you will get board approval. If this is your board, then they will just vote to approve. There's lots of different structures for financial committees and things like that, but the board approval, and it will go into your minutes, and then that will be your budget for the coming year. Good luck. Send me questions. I am happy to answer. And again, I hope you push the button, subscribe, and let me know what you think.